Welcome to my calm revenge. Today, I want to share with you a story that unfolds slowly, quietly, and with a steady kind of strength. It's not about shouting matches, dramatic walkouts, or explosive confrontations. It's about how calm reflection, patience, and quiet action can sometimes create the most powerful revenge of all. This is the story of a woman whose boyfriend once looked at her and said, "Honestly, you're draining. Give me a break." At first, those words seemed almost casual, like a comment tossed into the air. But words can land like stones. And when they come from someone you trust, from someone you've built a life with, they can feel like they cut straight through your chest. When she first met him, it wasn't fireworks or a whirlwind romance. It was steady, comfortable. She liked that. He had a calm way about him, confident but not arrogant. In the beginning, he made her laugh at silly things. He'd surprise her with coffee when she was stressed with work. And for a while, it seemed like the kind of relationship that grows roots instead of sparks. She liked roots. After years of short-lived relationships, the idea of stability mattered more to her than passion that burned too quickly and faded. They moved in together after about a year. At first, it felt like teamwork, splitting bills, grocery shopping, cleaning the apartment on weekends. They made routines. They cooked simple dinners. They watched shows together before bed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And she thought it was enough. But things don't always stay as they begin. She noticed the small changes first. The way he stopped asking about her day. The way his phone seemed to demand more attention than she did. The way laughter became rarer. Still, she brushed it aside. Relationships evolve, she told herself. Maybe he's just stressed. Maybe he's tired. Maybe if I do a little more, help a little more, he'll come back to himself. So she started carrying more of the load. She took care of dinner most nights. She cleaned more. She planned date nights just so they wouldn't slip away from each other completely. She told herself this was love. Love meant giving. But love without balance becomes weight. And one person carrying all the weight eventually starts to break. One evening, after a particularly long week, she finally sat down on the couch beside him. She felt worn out, invisible, like a background figure in her own home. She tried to start a conversation, something simple, just sharing about her day. He barely looked up. His face was tired, but not just from work. There was something else, a detachment. And then, almost without emotion, he said it. "Honestly, you're draining. Give me a break." The words hung in the air like smoke. She froze. It wasn't yelled. It wasn't cruel in tone. But it carried a truth she couldn't ignore. He saw her not as a partner, not as someone he cherished, but as a burden, a weight, something tiring. For a few moments, she didn't respond. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat there, replaying the words in her mind, draining. "Give me a break!" And in that silence, something shifted inside her. The rest of that night blurred into fragments, him going into the bedroom, her staying on the couch, staring at the muted television. Her chest felt hollow, but her mind was strangely calm, almost too calm. She realized something important. All this time, she had been bending herself, reshaping herself, working harder, giving more, trying to hold the relationship together. And yet, to him, she was draining. That was the moment she stopped trying. Not in a dramatic way, not with a slammed door or a tearful ultimatum, but quietly, in her own heart, she made a decision. If she was draining, then maybe it was time he felt the absence of her presence. For the next few days, she didn't confront him about it. She didn't bring up his words. Instead, she began to observe. She watched the way he moved through their shared space. She noticed how little he contributed, how rarely he asked about her. She noticed how his world seemed to orbit around himself, and she realized how invisible she had already become. So she decided to turn that invisibility into her strength. She started pulling back, not coldly, not with bitterness, but with calm detachment. She stopped filling the silence with questions about his day. She stopped organizing date nights he never seemed enthusiastic about. She stopped overextending herself just to keep things afloat. Instead, she poured her energy into herself. She signed up for a yoga class she'd been meaning to try. She spent weekends with friends she hadn't seen because she'd always been too busy. She read books she'd been putting off. She rediscovered her hobbies, her interests, her sense of self that had been slowly fading under the weight of the relationship. And all of this she did quietly, without announcement, without asking permission. At first, he didn't notice. He seemed almost relieved that she wasn't leaning on him as much. He had his break, but slowly cracks appeared. He'd ask why she wasn't home some evenings. She'd calmly say she was out with friends. He'd wonder why she didn't cook dinner, and she'd simply explain that she had plans, so he'd need to sort it out himself. Her independence began to unsettle him. He had expected her to remain, waiting, orbiting his life. But she was creating her own orbit, one where he wasn't the center. And while she never raised her voice, never argued, never accused, her calm detachment became the sharpest revenge. Because he started to feel something he hadn't expected: her absence. At first, his reaction was subtle, almost unnoticeable. He seemed to enjoy the quiet, the lack of her attention. He stayed out late with friends, scrolling endlessly on his phone, occasionally making offhand comments like, "It's nice you're not so needy anymore." But that relief didn't last long. What he once took for granted, the constant meals, the thoughtful gestures, the soft reminders that someone cared about him, was disappearing piece by piece. He didn't know it yet, but she was teaching him what it felt like to live without the comfort he had so easily dismissed. She wasn't cold, she wasn't hostile, she wasn't punishing him in any obvious way. She still spoke kindly, still answered when he asked something, still shared the same apartment with him. But the warmth that once wrapped around him like a blanket was gone, and the absence of that warmth began to feel colder than anger ever could. For her, the days became lighter. She started sleeping better, no longer staying awake, waiting for him to come home. She laughed more with her friends, realizing how much she had missed being fully present with people who genuinely valued her company. She filled her evenings with books, long walks, and journaling. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. He began to notice the difference. One night, he asked casually, "So, what's going on with you lately?" She smiled politely and said, "Nothing much, just keeping busy." It was the truth, but it wasn't the answer he was looking for. Another night, he texted her asking if she could pick up groceries on her way home. She replied with a short, simple message. "Sorry, I won't have time today." No explanation, no apology beyond that single word. It was such a small thing, yet it carried a weight he wasn't used to. She had always rearranged herself to fit his needs, but now she wasn't bending anymore. The cracks widened. He started asking about her schedule more often. "Where are you going? When will you be back?" And she would answer calmly, without defensiveness, but also without detail. "Just out for a bit. I'll be home later." Nothing more. It unsettled him. The control he once felt, the unspoken assumption that she revolved around him, was slipping away. He didn't realize that by calling her draining, he had given her the permission she needed to detach. What once felt like love to her had turned into effort, and when that effort ended, the relationship revealed its true imbalance. Her calm became his storm. There was one evening when he came home and found her dressed up, makeup done, hair styled. He hadn't seen her put that kind of effort into herself in a long time. Surprised, he asked, "Going somewhere?" "Yes," she said simply, slipping on her shoes. "With who?" His voice carried a sharpness he didn't intend. "Friends," she replied, her tone neutral, unbothered. Then she left without another word. He stood in the apartment, staring at the closed door, and felt something he hadn't felt in months: anxiety. He didn't know exactly where she was, or who she was with, or when she would be back. For so long, she had been predictable, always there, always waiting. But now she was a mystery again, and that mystery made him uneasy. The more she flourished, the more restless he became. He started suggesting they spend more time together. "Hey, we haven't had dinner out in a while. Want to go this weekend?" She would smile gently and say, "I already have plans, maybe another time." He offered to cook for her once, something he had rarely done. She thanked him, ate quietly, and then went back to her book afterward. No excitement, no appreciation beyond polite acknowledgement. He had wanted to win her back with one small effort, but she was beyond being swayed by crumbs. Slowly, his words began to change. "You've been different lately. You don't seem as invested in us anymore. Are you even happy here?" She listened, nodded, and answered with calm honesty, "I'm focusing on myself. I think that's important right now." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a threat. It was just the truth. But the truth can be more devastating than anger. For the first time, he started to feel what she had felt for months: the unease of not being enough, the worry of being overlooked, the creeping sense of invisibility. Only now, it wasn't her bending over backwards to keep him. It was him noticing she no longer felt the need to stay within his orbit. His frustration turned into small attempts at control. He tried to guilt her. "You don't make time for us anymore." He tried to provoke her. "You've changed, and not in a good way." But none of it stuck, because she no longer carried his emotions as her responsibility. She remained calm, detached, centered. One night, he sat her down, almost in the same way he had when he once told her she was draining. This time his tone was different, hesitant, uncertain. "Listen," he said, "I know things haven't been great lately. Maybe I said things I shouldn't have, but I feel like you're slipping away from me." She met his eyes, steady and unshaken. "You told me I was draining," she reminded him, her voice calm but clear. "I listened. I gave you your break, and I realized something during that break. I'm not a burden. I'm not too much. I was just with someone who couldn't appreciate me." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came, because deep down, he knew she was right. From that night forward, the roles had shifted completely. He began chasing, reaching, trying to grasp what he had let slip through his fingers. But she was no longer offering herself as something to be grasped. She was whole again, grounded in herself, and that made her untouchable. The sweetest revenge wasn't anger or retribution. It was this: the quiet strength of a woman who realized her worth and stopped begging to be seen. And the more she grew, the more he shrank. Over the next several weeks, the shift between them became undeniable. He noticed it most in the little moments, the everyday exchanges that used to be filled with comfort, but now carried a distance he couldn't bridge. When she made coffee in the morning, she poured only one cup, hers. When he asked about her day, she no longer offered the full story, just a brief outline, like sharing the weather rather than the details of her life. When he tried to hold her hand while watching television, she let him, but her body remained still, her focus elsewhere. She wasn't cruel, she wasn't punishing him, but she was no longer available in the way she once had been. And that, more than any angry confrontation, was the sharpest consequence of all. He began trying harder. He offered to plan a weekend trip, something he had always avoided because of the effort. She listened, nodded politely, and said, "That sounds nice." But there was no enthusiasm in her voice. She didn't argue, didn't complain, but she also didn't lean forward the way she once had. For her, the attachment had already thinned. It wasn't a game, it wasn't manipulation. It was simply the truth of her feelings. She had invested so deeply, given so much, that by the time he realized her value, her heart had already stepped away. One evening, she was getting ready to go out. She slipped into a dress she hadn't worn in years, something that reminded her of who she was before she became someone else's caretaker. She was smiling at her reflection when he walked in. "Wow," he said softly, almost surprised. "You look incredible." She turned, smiled politely, and replied, "Thank you." Then she grabbed her bag and left. That simple exchange lingered with him long after she was gone, because once she would have glowed at his compliment, would have leaned into his words, would have carried that moment with her. But now, it was as if his approval no longer mattered. And in truth, it didn't. She didn't need his validation anymore. He started to realize that he was living with someone who no longer belonged to him. She was sharing space, but not her heart. Her laughter, her energy, her warmth. They were directed outward, toward friends, toward hobbies, toward a life beyond the walls of the apartment. And he, who once held the center of her world, had been reduced to background noise. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had once called her draining, but now it was his presence that felt heavy, his attempts at pulling her back that felt exhausting. She didn't tell him this. She didn't need to. She simply lived in her truth, and the truth itself became louder than any words she could have spoken. There was one night when he finally broke the silence. They were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, and he said, almost desperately, "I don't want to lose you." She looked at him calmly, her eyes steady, her voice even. "You already did." He flinched at the words. Not because she said them cruelly, but because she said them so gently. Her calm made them undeniable. There was no fight to have, no argument to win, just the quiet reality that she had moved on in every way that mattered. From that point on, he seemed to linger in denial. He suggested therapy. He promised to do better. He even tried grand gestures, flowers, small surprises, half-hearted apologies. But by then, his efforts felt less like love and more like fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing someone he had assumed would always be there. And she, steady and composed, responded to each attempt with grace, but never with the devotion he hoped to spark. She accepted the flowers, thanked him for dinner, listened to his promises, but inside, she felt nothing that would tether her back to him. The final step came quietly. One morning, she packed a small bag. Not all her belongings, not everything at once, just enough to stay with a friend for a while. She left him a note, not a dramatic letter, not a list of grievances, just a short message. "I need space. I need peace. I'm choosing myself." She didn't slam the door on her way out. She didn't block his number. She didn't rage against the memories of what they once had. She simply left with calm certainty, carrying herself into the life she had already begun to build outside of him. For her, revenge wasn't about making him suffer. It wasn't about proving him wrong with anger or cruelty. It was about showing him and reminding herself that she was never a burden, that the person he once called draining was, in truth, a source of light he had dimmed with his neglect. And now that light was shining elsewhere, beyond his reach. In the weeks that followed, he sent messages. He asked her to come back. He promised change, begged for another chance. But by then, she read them with the same calm detachment she had cultivated. Sometimes she replied politely, other times she didn't reply at all. Because she no longer owed him explanations. She had given enough. Her life opened up in ways she hadn't expected. She traveled with friends, explored new interests, met new people, and slowly she realized that what she had once thought of as love had really been compromise stacked on compromise. Now, without that weight, she felt lighter, freer, whole. He, on the other hand, sat with the emptiness he had created. He remembered the comfort of her presence, the meals, the laughter, the endless giving, and he understood too late that his words, those careless, sharp words, had been the beginning of his own loss. The sweetest revenge wasn't in watching him suffer. It was in reclaiming herself so completely that his opinion no longer mattered. She didn't need him to apologize or regret, because his regret was his burden to carry. Her burden had already been lifted the moment she chose herself. And so, her story became one of quiet strength. She wasn't drained. She wasn't too much. She wasn't a weight for anyone to carry. She was simply someone who had outgrown a man who couldn't see her worth. And the calm way she left, the steady dignity with which she carried herself, that was her revenge. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It isn't explosive. It's simply walking away with grace, leaving behind the person who underestimated you, and building a life where you are no longer waiting to be appreciated. And in that quiet departure, she had the final word. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to stay with us here at My Calm Revenge. There are more stories like this, real, personal, and told with the same steady honesty. If this one resonated with you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more calm revenge stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I look forward to sharing the next one with you.